Messaging of men struggling to be men has been around since Me Too happened in 2017. Guys are saying that they're scared to give a woman a compliment. They feel like they're going to be persecuted just for being a man. And then in comes Trump for his second win. After losing in 2020, he certainly made sure that people were going to be loyal to him this time. The messaging has been very clear. The measure of a man depends on how much he is respected by other men.
And we will not forget our God.
We've seen Trump make people of the Republican Party basically eat in order to be able to get in line. Remember how RFK Jr. was saying that fast food was poisonous and how he looked down on Trump for eating it? And then that got followed by what image? Oh yeah, him having to smile whilst he ate it. Mark Zuckerberg, seeing that Trump would win, flew over to Mar-a-Lago in order to be able to court him and able to be able to woo him and inflate his ego. He donated a bunch of money to Trump and came up with this cringeworthy video where he was repealing hate speech on his platform. And of course, getting rid of fact-checking, which is very important for this video. Like, does anybody remember when he and Elon Musk were being called like loser internet dudes that weren't real men, and then Zuckerberg went on like this whole journey of going to MMA fighting and becoming like this buff man, and now that his mega transformation has been completed, he is respected more as a man. Whatever happened to that fight that they were going to have? I think Zuckerberg maybe would have gone through with it, but Musk, as we know from his track record, if any of you also watch Some More News, he doesn't really follow through. And we all remember the billionaire space race with their not so subtle phallic imagery as well, right? And Elon Musk paid for the benefit of using Trump's position of power for his own gain. Well, is it really gain when your company is doing so badly with all the things that you're doing? Now, have I liked any of these guys previously? No, but it is really important to note where the money has aligned itself. These men have all bent the knee to get along with the bully in order to be part of the in crowd. Just look at Trump's inauguration. But for Trump, respect means unquestioning and undying loyalty to him. We all remember the attempted coup on January 6th, where people were chanting for Mike Pence's head. That was 5 years ago, and the support for Trump has only gotten more fervent since then. What we're seeing is fascist historian Robert Paxton says, it's bubbling up from below in very worrisome ways. And that's very much like the original fascisms. It's the real thing. It really is. Oh, you don't believe me or the experts? It's okay. I've got my sources. I've been working on this video for months. We're getting into it. We're seeing Harvard University being threatened with a funding freeze for not complying with Trump's orders, which he claims are anti-Semitic, but that's really BS. It reveals what he wants is more white conservative men to be hired and also admitted into the university by removing DEI. And he also wants a strict mask ban in place. That's not because, he just hates masks or anything. It's for surveillance purposes. We know this. And Harvard's going to sue. And if you want to keep on top of all of the stuff which Trump is doing constantly, because it's near impossible to, I highly recommend checking out Lee Jamiller's channel. She does incredible work. They're trying to launch an autism database which is not voluntary, where Americans' private medical information is sifted through in order to be able to create this list of people with autism, this list of people with disabilities. History doesn't really show us that things that happen from these lists is a good thing. This comes after RFK Jr. went on a scientifically inaccurate tirade trying to find the, quote, real cause of autism by September of this year, apparently. We've seen Gilmar Abrego Garcia be sentenced without due process and sent to El Salvador. Actually, this has happened to hundreds more people, with due process being entirely overlooked, even though they were allowed to be in the US to begin with. In the UK, it has just been ruled that a woman can only be a biological woman. And it's even gotten to here where New Zealand First, part of the coalition government, Winston Peters is a wannabe Trump. It's very cringeworthy. He's proposing a bill of the same. Hungary banned LGBTQIA+ marches or protests. Whilst I've enjoyed seeing people come together to do the grey parades, this is incredibly frightening. And we've got the deportation of people speaking up about Palestine. We have been seeing a whole lot of othering and a whole lot of punishment for not getting in line with Trump. But how the hell does all of this link together? Where does the masculinity crisis even come into play? Well, we're exploring it today. That's why I've been working on this for literal months and reading some very heavy books and studies about this. My lovely patrons, you've already got the extended and uncensored version of this video because there's definitely some topics that I need to cover, which I can't on YouTube and still earn money for the work which I do. So sorry if there's some things that you're like, oh, but what about this? Because it's probably covered in my Patreon video. Let's just try and define fascism so we're all on the same playing field here. However, as experts will tell you, it is incredibly hard to define because it's so based on whatever nation it comes from that it kind of changes the way it looks depending on where it is. So it doesn't always appear the same way, it doesn't always follow the same rules. As Robert O. Paxton in Anatomy of Fascism writes, to give fascism a usable shorthandle, even though a definition of fascism encompasses its subject no better than a snapshot encompasses a person, fascism may be defined as a form of political behaviour marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, which a mass-based party of committed national militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints the goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. As I was reading that out, you were getting a whole lot of little red flags pop up, hey? Or maybe I should say red caps. Fascism has been described as reactionary from its very conception, and this is consistently manifested in an anti-minority stance. This is because fascism does not intend to present revolutionary ideas. Instead, it relies on the notion that its policies are simply a return to the traditional way of life. Even more red flags popping up because I'm sure that you were also envisioning raw milk, trad wives, homesteading, anti-vaccines, with all of that back to nature but with a racist undertone that's been soaring in popularity, right? Like any modern conservative populist movement, fascism has a complicated relationship with the establishment. It is outwardly very much anti-elite, but in Mussolini's own words, fascism is a merger of state and corporate power. More often, their aversion to the elite manifests as a rejection of intellectualism, an institution often at odds with conservative, hypermasculine caricatures embraced by fascism. And now you see the manosphere with people like Andrew Tate saying that he doesn't read books. Unschooling children and the popularity of that, homeschooling children and the growing popularity of that too. And also people becoming disillusioned with higher education, though I would definitely be arguing, as I have made 2 videos about, that is much more to do with student loan debt and the fact that it doesn't guarantee you to be able to get a well enough paying job to be able to pay that off, or a fulfilling job from even going to university. And one thing which is critical to note when it comes to fascism is that it is in direct opposition to anything left-leaning. Marxists, fascism's first victims, the definition of fascism as an instrument of the big bourgeoisie for fighting the proletariat when the legal means available to the state proved insufficient to subdue them. In Stalin's day, this hardened to an iron-bound formula that became communist orthodoxy for half a century. Yet so much rhetoric from fascists is directly against the elite. It is specifically trying to appeal to the working man, the working class white man very specifically. However, throughout history, it's been the rich conservative people, the big business owners, who have actually sided with fascism in order to be able to keep the left out. The inauguration is making a lot more sense now, eh? Remember all of those billionaires just randomly deciding to all donate exactly $1 million to him? Conservatives and money really go hand in hand when you get to like a wealthy status. In reference to Italy and Germany, 2 countries where fascism was, quote, successful, as in it actually gained power there, conservative national leaders in both countries decided that what the fascists had to offer outweighed the disadvantage of allowing these ruffians to capture public space from the left by violence. The national press and conservative leaders in both countries consistently applied a double standard to judging fascist and left-wing violence. We're suddenly making a lot more sense when it comes to the student protests, hey! Ruth Ben-Ghiat is an expert in the history of fascism. As she wrote about Silvio Berlusconi, Italy's former prime minister, like Trump, he was often treated as a clown, a buffoon, especially because, like Trump, he specialized in outrageous comments. He would use sexist, racist things to steer media attention away from his corruption, which is what Trump has learned to do very well. For corrupt and criminal leaders, the truth is highly dangerous. They start demonizing the press on their way to power if they're running for office. If there's still democracy enough that people can expose them, prosecutors or journalists who can expose them, that is, the public has to be already believing that they are partisan hacks. We literally saw this with Trump adopting the exact same thing that happened in Germany with Lügenpresse, lying press, or fake news. And this is an incredibly important note, and I want to say this early in the video because I'm sure that there's going to be people commenting like this. People love to say how insane or how stupid people are for falling for fascism, for going along with it. As much as people like to mock people like Trump, or say that they're insane or whatever, or they've got no idea what they're doing.
It is better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. That's a famous Mussolini quote. You retweeted it. You like the quote? Did you know it was
Sure.
Mussolini?
It's okay to know it's Mussolini. Look, Mussolini was Mussolini.
It completely undermines the actual evil which is happening here, and also how this appeals to people's base instincts. By reducing these types of people to jokes, it makes them into sympathetic characters, which Rowan Ellis has done a fantastic video on. I'm going to have that linked for you down below. But as Robert Paxton says, to conclude that forms of fascism are forms of mental disturbances is doubly dangerous as it offers an alibi to the multitude of normal fascists and fails to prepare us for the utter normality of authentic fascism. Most fascist leaders and militants were quite ordinary people thrust into positions of extraordinary power and responsibility by processes that are perfectly comprehensible in rational terms. The banality of evil, if you will. It's all very normal and it's people making rational decisions. Crisis of the political and economic system made a space available to fascism, but it was the unfortunate choices by a few powerful establishment leaders that actually put the fascists into that space. Are you seeing it now? Great. If not, all of my sources, as always, are linked for you down below. But we really need to address how masculinity crisis links in with this.
You should be a monster. You know, because everyone says, well, you should be harmless, virtuous. You shouldn't do anyone any harm. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try to win. You know, you don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too assertive. You want to take a back seat and all of that. It's like, no. Wrong. You should be a monster.
Masculinity crisis has happened multiple times over the past 100 years even. Men are oppressed, you see, and you know what? I agree with you. But what men are oppressed by is patriarchal masculinity and the expectations put on men to be able to uphold this perfect image of what a man should be, and trying to succeed to those standards in capitalism. Patriarchal masculinity affects men by drafting them into wars, of having to fit into the provider role, to cutting themselves off from feeling and processing their emotions in a healthy way from youth, which means that they don't know how to handle them when they grow up. From the sheer concept of masculinity being so fragile that any sliver of doubt that gets thrown your way means that you have to fight to defend your manhood. And the absolute crushing weight of trying to be this standard and have all of the correct symbols of masculinity when we're in a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, where it's really incredibly hard to get a job, let alone a well-paying and secure job. And wealth disparity has only gotten worse from 2020 with the pandemic starting there. We can't forget how many companies are basically oligarchies now at this point from the amount of other brands and companies that they own. It is hard for men to get any of those signifiers to be able to feel like a real man. Things are not good, and that's for any gender, not just men. Take a typical case of a skilled workman out of employment. He walks from factory to factory, knowing his own skill, but driven away each time because his labour is not wanted. The wife has probably gone into the factory. Think of the degradation of that man's manhood that his own wife should become the breadwinner instead of himself. That was a speech from 1911 that the Labour MP James O'Grady made. Masculinity is something to be reaffirmed and constantly under surveillance. Remember how I made my 2000 series years ago and just how binary things were then? How homophobia was incredibly rampant and men had to constantly be proving themselves through these patriarchal masculinity structures. Like, my God, the term metrosexual existed for men that had a shower and didn't just do the sniff test before they put on an outfit. When I grew up in the UK, there was this chocolate bar called Yorkie, which was specifically targeted not for girls, so just for men. And that's because eating chocolate was considered to be effeminate. Their ads read things like, "You got the vote, be happy with that. Save your money for driving lessons. King size, not queen size." All of this in the 2000s was a backlash to the girl power movement that was happening in the 90s. Very important that men stay on top, and in order to be able to do that, you have to put women down. And in the 2000s, it was put literally everybody down that wasn't like an attractive cis-het man, or also able-bodied. Like, the 2000s was pretty bad. In Perceptions of Crisis in the History of Masculinity, written by Ben Griffin, Men and Masculinities in Modern Britain, identified crisis of masculinity at the end of the 19th century, during the First World War, and during the interwar period, while sociological studies of Britain since 1945 have likewise identified multiple instances of manhood in crisis. And there's also not one kind of masculinity that a guy can be. To say that there's a crisis of masculinity is usually to make a claim about an unsettling of a broader set of power relation within which masculinity is situated, a crisis of the gender order rather than one of its parts. This rhetoric also treats masculinity as a synonym for the position of men within the structure, thereby failing to acknowledge either that there are multiple masculinities in any society, or that gender refers to the cultural interpretation of sexual differences rather than, quote, men. So it really does come down to men not feeling in complete power and control. Yet, it's easy to argue that masculinity was in crisis, when in practice the gender order has proved remarkably resilient. As discussed in my last video, this is very much a patriarchal world that we're living in. Men are very much still on top. White men specifically. Individual men could perform more than one of these models over the course of a life cycle, or even over the course of a single day. The good husband and the football hooligan, the businessman and the biker, all could be descriptions of the same man. And it all depends on who you are and who you associate with, and like your general geography as to how masculinity presents and how it gets valued too. Like if you grew up going to a very rich and posh school, masculinity is going to look very different there in comparison to if you grew up in a coal mining town in the UK. And I want you to think of the image that often comes to mind when we think of traditional or classic. Just like classic clothing, it always comes back to this sort of 1950s American sort of version. You know, like when it comes to clothing, the tailoring that was there, like the dress which I'm wearing today, it's like nipped in waist and then you have a nice big flowy skirt. When you say a classic car to people, they tend to envision a 1950s car. Yet over the thousands of years that men have lived on this planet, their style has evolved so very many times. And we know that style and fashion is set by the rich. Men were the ones to wear heels, men wore makeup, men wore puffy wigs, men powdered their hair. Yet we don't get to see any of these beautiful articles of clothing come in. We don't get to see all these gorgeous details on the clothes. No, it really tends to fall back on whatever looked cool in the 50s. It's a very grounding point in Western culture at least, and yes, we are picking it apart in a bit. The emergence of new models could at all times prove disorienting for men, but it's important not to misidentify the routine process of cultural contestation as symptoms of a crisis. When, in 1931, S.F. Hatton complained about young men who are more given to the soft delights of cinema and the dance hall than the more vigorous and manly sporting instincts of boxing, football, and such like pastimes, this was simply the ordinary work of the gender order, not a symptom of a deeper dislocation. So you can see the, quote, masculinity crisis that is being faced by men today is not unique at all. Masculinity has basically always been in crisis. It comes up with new technology when marginalized people start to get a few more rights, but definitely never the same amount of rights as what white men get. Think about the last decade. It's been very significant in terms of strides when it comes to marginalized people. Women spoke up about SA. BLM finally got taken seriously, and there were some concerted efforts to make sure that there was genuine inclusivity. A lot of times it was more just for show, but you know, awareness had increased. Still got a way to go, let's be real. And we had a global pandemic, which is still going on by the way, where millions of people lost their lives and millions more became disabled. You're watching one of them right now. And importantly, it was during that time that the more privileged people who had office jobs and the like, you know, like I did, you were able to work from home. And that was when a lot of people started to realize, oh wow, I've got a bit of free time now. Why are all of these rich people in these fancy houses complaining about being locked up and having life so hard when I can barely even afford the rent on my terrible flat where I've got heaps of flatmates here? People are realizing how bad the wealth gap actually was and how living to work hadn't really been making anybody happy. People started talking about unionizing, about workers' rights, about the ability to work from home and how important it was to have flexible working, the extra workload on mothers. Like, so much more discussion was happening of a left-leaning nature. Ding, 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 you can see those alarm bells going, hey, we gotta bring people back to the office. We can't let people have those sorts of thoughts. No, we gotta squash that. And now we've got Trump again. Instead of COVID making things more equal for people, making sure that people had more workers' rights, ensuring that people had more secure employment. No, the rich just got richer and people's job security actually went down. Of course, this is going to leave people angry and frustrated, but the impression that was given to white men in particular wasn't that everyone was struggling, it was that they were struggling more, that they were being targeted. I'm not saying that performing masculinity isn't hard. It's that it's always been challenging for people to do so properly. There is so much ageism, ableism, racism, and classism which all comes into play to make this even harder. It is hard to be the strange archetype of what a man should be, in a world where capitalism has effectively cooked things for all of us. However, fascism perfectly appeals to these feelings. From Did It Happen Here? Perspectives on Fascism in America, illiberalism, hypermasculinity, blood and soil nationalism, a love of strong men and state power, and politics driven by grievance and anger. That sounds an awful lot like the US, right?
Red, the blood of angry men.
Who you fighting? At least in Les Mis they were fighting against the rich. You're literally punching down at people less privileged than you. As explained in my last video, it doesn't make sense. From the book Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan M Metzel, crisis often assumes an upheaval felt by a dominant group in the face of a threat or change that leaves previous power structures up, and we often hear, for instance, of a crisis of masculinity brought about by feminism or the women's movement, or women's entry into the workforce, or the #MeToo movement, or any number of other things in which striving for equality by women is met with uncertainty by men. And we've seen this enacted with the way that people are voting. Younger men are overwhelmingly the ones voting for more right-leaning parties. As is evident in the US election last year with Trump, 56% of men aged 18 to 29 voted for him. And like I said last time, white women, I ain't forgetting about you. In Germany, Pew Research in 2024 found that 26% of German men had positive views of the AfD compared to 11% of women. And the share of men holding this opinion has risen 10 points since 2022. And even here in Aotearoa, across a survey of 1,003 people, 30% said they strongly or somewhat approved of the job Trump was doing as president, while 62% strongly or somewhat disapproved. That gives us a net negative 32 approval rating across the board. Zoom in on the respondents, however, and the only category that returns a positive net approval rating is men aged under 40. They give a net 14 positive assessment. It's a stark contrast with women in the same age group, among whom the rating was minus 39. Polling by Essential in Australia found that across a range of measures, men aged 18 to 34 thought Trump would have a positive impact at vastly greater rates than other cohorts. On everything from world peace to climate change to the Australian economy, these young men are twice as likely to see Trump as a positive influence compared with the broader population. As Robert Paxton writes in the book Anatomy of Fascism, the legitimization of violence against demonized internal enemy brings us close to the heart of fascism. For some, fascist violence was more than useful. Violence often appeals to men too young to know it. One hears echoes of classical fascism, fears of decadence and decline, assertion of national and cultural identity, a threat by unassimilable foreigners to national identity and good social order, and the need for greater authority to deal with these problems. Oh dear. We need to put patriarchy back where it belongs, in power. It never left.
How are things on Mad Ave, Don? Well, looks like they're taking care of you. We got it all, huh? Yep, this is it.
Was the 1950s actually a really good time? Was it the real peak time for men? The 1950s is seen as an idyllic time. When I was a teenager, I definitely fell into this trap as well. But also, there were some really good things about the 1950s. It was when worker protections were higher because of union involvement. Literally, the highest time of union involvement in the US was in the 1940s and 1950s. That's also when the government taxed the rich far more. But no, it's not the 91% that I see a lot of people sharing. I fact check things here. The effective tax rate for the top 1% was lower due to numerous deductions and loopholes. In reality, top earners in the 1950s were paying about 42 to 45% of their income in taxes, while today it's closer to 26 to 28%. But it is still higher, and when it comes to someone earning that much money, that difference does actually make a big difference. At least it makes a big difference to us plebs. Maybe not to them, because they're still fine. And that's also when government was actually spending money to build houses and infrastructure. As you can see from this Pew chart, which sadly only goes up to 2018, despite the article coming out in 2023, government investment in infrastructure was huge. Was sadly a lot of it for roads, yes, but you can have a look at the channel, Not Just Bikes, in case you're interested in that. We love their work because we're nerds like that. We watch a lot of weird documentary stuff. And when people think of the 1950s, they often think of America in the 1950s, you know, the US, as opposed to like Europe, where buildings and cities were in shambles and heaps of people had died and stuff. You know, America, like, they got off pretty scot-free and then became a superpower, and I could go on about that for way too long. This video is going to be long anyway. The vision strangely often reverts to women in 1950s dresses in these cookie-cutter houses where they stayed home with a nuclear family, which was popularized in the 1950s, by the way, through PSAs and through a lot of propaganda. There is a really good PBS video, I'll link it down below for you so you can really unpack how bizarre the nuclear family actually is. It was very much a middle-class white ideal, 2.5 kids and a dog, and dinner on the table for 5 o'clock when you got home from work. Oh, imagine that, finishing your work day and being home at 5. My goodness, they even had more time back then. Oh, and all of this could be achieved on the man's single salary. Just to note, this is very much about white people. Because not everyone was having a great time in the 1950s. That's the idyllic picture conjured though, not the other stuff, the actual important stuff which enabled the newly growing middle class to survive on a single salary and raise a family on that. Oh, and also the women weren't all happy back then, much as people may like to have this weird idea in their heads that they were. Do you know what Mummy's Little Helper was? It wasn't a little kitchen tool that you had, it was Valium. And husbands had complete say over their wives as well, because, they financially supported them, so whatever they said goes. This even impacted their medical treatment, and wow, wouldn't you know it, women got called crazy all the time, and look at the lobotomies. And DV wasn't even really a thing back then, so no, the women weren't all sunshine and rainbows and having the best time. But the really important thing to note is that the image of the 1950s encapsulates average white people prospering, with men at the helm who had complete say over, quote, their households in whatever way they wanted to enact that power. But fellas, the guys weren't really happy back then either. When I say masculinity crisis has been a recurring thing and has basically not gone away, it really hasn't. A number of men had come back from fighting in a war mentally or physically scarred. And don't forget about the ugly laws that used to exist as well. They had no way to cope with the traumas of that. And then they had to fit into this happy patriarchal role and be a useful cog in capitalism, where the thing that you were fighting for wasn't stopping fascism and being in the thick of it with your bros. Instead, it was just making money for the man at the top. It lacked any real meaning, and this is when consumerism was absolutely on the rise, was from the 1950s. So it's a lot more about just stuff. The only way to really prove your masculinity was to go up the corporate ladder now and view each other as enemies as opposed to brothers. And men felt emasculated if others succeeded. They also felt emasculated if their wife wasn't the perfect image of what a wife should be, the doting, compliant, docile wife who would just do everything that you wanted. Because if she wasn't doing that, then she was undermining him as the patriarch.
You don't want me to have what I want.
And plus, in the 50s, there was a masculinity crisis as well, because there were a generation of men who had fought in the first war, known as the Great War, which was seen to be more masculine because it was closer combat. They didn't have technology as far ahead as what they did in the Second World War. So they were revered to be more real men, and they would look down on the younger generations of men.
Don never talks about the war.
The war? His war, you mean?
Not much to say. You boys used up all the glory.
We did, didn't we? Of course, my old man will always have one on me, that bayonet.
If they'd only fought in the Second World War. And for the guys that didn't go through war, then they felt cheated for the fact that they weren't able to prove themselves by being able to be a real man and fight. This even gets referenced to Mad Men, and by the way, if you're not subscribed to Jose, I'll leave their video on Mad Men down below for anyone else that loves the show as much as me. I'd written a massive section diving into all sorts of stuff, but this video would be too long, so maybe another day. This was all famously discussed in David Reisman's study, The Lonely Crowd, published in 1950, where it blames masculinity crisis being faced by men having to be in the domestic sphere now, doing women's work, and how women have been holding men's jobs in World War II, making men question themselves. And Reisman argued that Americans were coming to adjust their behaviour to the perceived expectations of important others whose approval they sought. Sounds familiar, right? Because you need to be able to prove your masculinity from those around you and have the admiration of those around you. You've got to have the right kind of clout. It's not really about internally driven stuff, about your own morals and everything. It's what others perceive, because again, masculinity as a concept is pretty fragile and can be questioned at any time. Again, in the book Dying of Whiteness. In the 1940s and 50s, authors such as Philip Wiley and David Reisman described crises and patriarchal authority brought about when corporate cultures and suburban lifestyles forced middle-class men to take on qualities and skills traditionally identified with women. In fact, the durability of these arguments led contemporary authors as far-ranging as Susan Faludi and James Gilbert to explore crises as the perpetual component of Western masculinity. Of course, masculinity crises likely were felt very real from the perspective of men who experienced them. Somewhere, sometimes, some men woke up one morning to learn that the hierarchies on which they built their picket fences and senses of accomplishment appeared threatened or already overturned, instead of the automatic authority they accrued by simply showing up. These men found themselves in a world in which they faced more competition and enjoyed less prestige. Maybe they even had to make their own dinners or type their own memos. According to evolutionary biology, these men responded in predictable ways by smoking, fighting, drinking, pumping iron, driving too fast, or other modes of chest beating that restore a sensation of order, but that also increase their blood pressures and shorten their collective lifespans. The way we define crisis allows us to attach a language of calamity to whiteness or other seemingly dominant groups, whilst at the same time making it harder to see the suffering of women, immigrants of colour, and other persons who do merit a crisis of authority because they are supposedly built for it. This logic suggests that men need to be on top because they embody no skills for acting otherwise, and everyone else, to paraphrase an important book about women of colour feminism, are born with bridges called their backs. Such framing of crisis is also based more in an imagined sense of nostalgia than a lived reality, and as much as many men fought to maintain what they had held to be their natural authority, even though every man was not a king or a boss, or plantation owner or CEO, by definition the majority of men needed to be underlings for the system to survive. I highly recommend reading the book, but I will say it is very heavy reading and dark, very dark. Like I said, there were indeed great things about the 50s, but it's more to do with all of this as opposed to this weird image. However, it's always this that people come back to. And we also can't forget the sinister undercurrent which is always present when it comes to nostalgia about the 1950s, that it was a segregated time. Civil rights movements were starting in the 1950s. So there's a real racist cruelty behind this romantic image. Do you know what else was really popular in the 1950s? A fear of communism and socialism. So much so that Hollywood stars are being investigated. Like, I even talked about this in my Marilyn Monroe video. Like, she got told off for reading a book that sided with communists because she's like, no, but it makes sense to make sure that people have what they need. Arthur Miller, her jerk of a husband, got investigated too. This paranoia made people suspicious of each other, you know, McCarthyism. There were two Red Scares that happened. The first was after the First World War, and the second was after the Second World War. Interesting how that happens, hey? But even if people held slightly progressive views, they were potentially subversive and friendly to the Reds. But it's also really interesting because this was one of the most progressive times in American history, right? This is where you had higher taxes, where government investment was actually going to support the people, and incredibly strong unions. Like, all of these things are more left-leaning, and yet they're just constantly paranoid about socialism and communism. And the Red Scare has had a huge impact on Western society, especially the US, ever since. Like, socialism is seen to be such an incredibly dirty word, and we could look at all of the things that the US has done in order to make sure that socialism never actually thrives, but that would be another video. But this fear of the left is critically important when it comes to fascism, and it also makes a lot more sense as to another reason why the 50s is such a romanticized time.
You can't make me look uncool in front of Ken.
Ken's not cool!
He is to me.
Masculinity is incredibly rigid, but also fragile, almost like a glass sculpture of the Punisher.
Barely gets nicked there once and kaboom! He's history.
Masculinity is even defined by the kind of car that you drive. Like, electric cars are typically associated with dirty, nasty leftists like me. And petrol and diesel cars, especially really big cars, are associated with masculinity, especially with right-wing masculinity. And yet Elon Musk was begging people to please buy his cars, and even Trump did this whole, like, what was it, QVS sort of like, hey, you should buy this car, and like, you saw what he was reading. It was literally just an ad read for Tesla. Speaking of Elon, gender-affirming care for men is highly prioritized. Just look at how much research has gone into erectile dysfunction in comparison to women's issues. But when we're talking about gender-affirming care, think about the hair plugs or hair transplant, whatever you want to call it, that Elon Musk got. More men in Hollywood have had this or similar gender-affirming care to target hair loss than you may think. But it's never referred to as gender-affirming care, right? That's only ever for dirty, nasty others, trans people, in other words. But gender-affirming care is the same as when women get breast implants. And also, I don't want anybody mocking these guys for feeling worried and feeling like they had to get hair plugs or had to get Rogaine or whatever, all of the many things which guys can do to make sure that they have a fuller head of hair. Because Hollywood really is a beacon for patriarchal norms. Bald men aren't really treated all that well in Hollywood. If you're a bald man in Hollywood, you get to be a tough old man or a grumpy old man. Or there's two examples of being a sassy man, Stanley Tucci and Picard. Or you can be Jason Statham. Like Chris Evans was incredibly worried about his role as Captain America because his hair was thinning. I'm supposed to be like this superior human. He can't be balding. How horrible would it be if this superior man has male pattern baldness? I personally think it would have been really good representation personally, but I'm not a union busting mouse. But when it comes to Elon Musk, the way that he used to look has been used as a way to mock him repeatedly. He is such an example of someone that desperately wants to perform masculinity right in order to be able to be liked by other men.
It matters to me that you're impressed.
You guys are awesome. Honestly, this is
like whether it's coming out with really terrible memes or saying that he's a really good gamer when allegedly he pays people to play the games for him. He makes me think of someone like Kendall Roy, but with even worse business sense.
Love me. Love me.
He's also incredibly paranoid, with his 20 bodyguards getting deputized by marshals, giving them certain rights and protections of federal law enforcement agents. But Musk doesn't even think this level of protection is enough. It's not enormous, maybe it should be bigger. He's also allegedly said in texts that he is number 2 after Trump for assassination, and that only the paranoid survive. I guess this is why one of his kids is with him so often. And Musk is also known as a voyager to his security detail. Catherine Janeway would take great offense. Eye roll queen. Elon is such a sad dude.
Who's the bitterest man in the living room? The bitterest man in the living room. Hi, neighbor.
But you're not going to find me pitying a guy with enough money to end world hunger, which he still refused to do, even though someone provided him with the plans and exactly how to do it. Who also allegedly keeps on seeking out women to impregnate in order to have what? To reach Legion level before the apocalypse. Musk's messages reportedly read, "We will need to use surrogates." And he's an absent father to goodness knows how many children at this point. I don't have pity for the billionaire who can literally afford every single luxury in the world, yet is insisting on making everyone else's lives incredibly hard in order to serve his own ego. Like, Elon is basically what happens when trying to keep up with patriarchal standards meets with hyper-individualism and capitalism. It's not the best, brightest, kindest, or hardest working that rises to the top. Oh no. And for a strange reflection on today's version of masculinity and consumerist culture, we can look to American Psycho himself, Patrick Bateman. Another movie which has been horribly misinterpreted. The whole thing is a satire. A man who is meticulous about how he looks, about how he's perceived, and the importance of climbing that corporate ladder and earning the admiration from others. Well, men really. Masculinity in highly consumerist times, like it was in the 80s, like it is now, has allowed a lot of men to get in on this grift too. But brands also know that, wow, we can make a lot of money by making men feel like they need to buy all of this stuff to be able to be a high status man, right? So men have become these influencers, though they rather think of themselves as leaders, but it's all still linking back to all of this stuff which people can buy, sponsored stuff and buy my course and all of this other BS. Because how masculinity is performed today is by wealth and clout. However, on the flip side, it is really important to suffer to prove that you're a real man. So you're going to see a lot of ice baths linked in because...
Oh, God.
Get out!
No. This ice bath is my bitch.
Like, remember the trend of guys, quote, raw dogging flying last year to prove that they were hard enough to be able to cope with it, to prove some sort of weird stoicism, this weird mindfulness thing, like trying to prove this point to who? Like, who are you? Like, people could just lie about it, say that they did it and they didn't. Like, it would be so easy to do that. Because the way to prove that you're a man is by suffering. Because there's no war for guys to fight in today. yet. So you have to find other ways to feel alive and be a man, because you can't go being too soft.
A 30-year-old boy.
We're a generation of men raised by women. I'm wondering if another woman is really the answer we need.
And plus, people can't really go starting fight clubs now without getting really arrested for it, even though, sadly, that was a thing which came up because of the movie Fight Club, because, again, media literacy. It's so sad that that movie's been ruined because it's actually a really good movie. So men have had to get creative to show ways of how much they can endure. It's all about the gains, being in control. It's all about self-discipline. It's all about making sure that you're eating the most boring food in order to be able to prioritize gains. It's having disgusting protein shakes all the time. It doesn't, just whatever, it's all about the gains.
I don't have any interests. I don't have any hobbies. Okay, if I'm not a success, then I'm nothing. And I can't handle being nothing.
Masculinity relies on other people affirming that, yeah, you're a man. You're man enough, you're good enough. And that respect is so important. Any slip in that respect, not acceptable. If masculinity is so weak that people need to buy a gun in order to be able to carry a man card, we are in a sorry state. This masculinity crisis is really hurting our men and boys. And I don't want anyone to feel sad or depressed because they can't fit into this narrow mold of what masculinity is meant to be.
With all the force of a great typhoon.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500 for a pardon. Yes. Full pardon.
So how does fascism link into all of this? Fascism thrives off young men's anger. Why do you think Trump went on all of those dude bro podcasts? And why do you think after he was the one that tried to take TikTok away, was the one that was being praised for bringing it back? Because that's where the cool youth are. I know, because I'm not one of them. And as I said earlier, fascism changes depending on the nation. Robert Paxton, in his book The Anatomy of Fascism, anticipated what fascism would look like in the US. This book was written in 2004. Let's see how accurate it is. Since September 2001, however, civil liberties have been curtailed to popular acclaim in a patriotic war on terrorists. The language and symbol is an authentic American fascism would of course have little to do with the original European models. They would have to be as familiar and reassuring to loyal Americans as the language and symbols of the original fascists were familiar and reassuring to many Italians or Germans. Stars and stripes or stars and bars. And Christian crosses, no fascist salute but mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. Already something which happens in schools anyway, which has always been weird to me. These symbols contain no whiff of fascism in themselves, of course, but an American fascism would transform them into an obligatory litmus test for detecting the internal enemy around such reassuring language and symbols. National prestige Americans might support an enterprise of forcible national reintegration, unification, and purification. Its targets would be the First Amendment, separation of church and state, questions on the law and prayers in schools, efforts to place control on gun ownership, desecrations of the flag on assimilated minorities, artistic license. This isn't an unusual behaviour of all sorts that could be labelled anti-national or decadent. We all remember what happened to the sports stars that bent a knee, right?
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!
I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color.
Red hats, anybody? Or black hats for those edgy ones that want to just take things a little bit further?
I'm not just MAGA. I'm dark, gothic MAGA.
I smell desperation. I smell sadness. I smell a need to construct a false identity.
Labeling things as anti-nationalistic, or the dog whistle which is being used now, anti-Semitic. Because that's being used against people that are protesting against the genocide which is still happening in Gaza. Throughout Trump's entire time, he has leaned heavily into Christianity.
Most importantly, I brought my Bible. Okay?
And remember how he stated, don't worry Christians, don't worry, this will be the last time you have to vote.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You gotta get out and vote.
And how many times has he stated concerns about enemies outside, but also enemies within? And if you want proof of his expansionism, look at what he's done with trying to, well, he's made people rename it to be the Gulf of America. He wants Canada to be the 51st state and is trying to gun for Greenland as well. But interestingly, the opposite happened to what Paxton anticipated. More controls have not been put in place when it comes to gun ownership. In fact, it's been more of an embracement of people who do have guns. You're basically creating a young, willing militia through this. But how does this link in with the masculinity crisis? Mobilizing passions, a sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of any traditional solutions, the primacy of the group towards which one has duties superior to every right, whether individual or universal, and the subordination of the individual to it. The belief that one's group is a victim is a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, both internal and external. Fear of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences. The need for closer integration of a purer community, by consent if possible, by exclusionary violence if necessary. The need for authority by natural chiefs, always a male, culminating in a national chieftain, who alone is capable of incarnating the group's historical destiny, the superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason, the beauty of violence and the efficacy of will when they are devoted to the group's success. The right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law. Right being decided by the sole criterion of the group's prowess within a Darwinian struggle. And as is discussed in the book, this is definitely the stance that Israel has taken and the support for Israel has taken. Because what have we been seeing over these past 2 years in particular, whilst people have been more vocal, speaking out against all of the atrocities which have been happening? All of that messaging being used to justify the war crimes. This truck with "Make Women Property Again" emblazoned on the back of it, it basically sums up these feelings of animosity towards women that these men are holding. How they've blamed women and are ready for violence. We all remember Parks and Recreation, one of my favourite comfort TV shows. I think I've watched it 5 times. I'm on my 6th time now. A character like Ron Swanson is a classic libertarian, but you won't find someone like him now. This dude always admired strong women, and then when he got with Xena, what's her name? And her kids, he actually changed his mindsets. He changed and became a softer, kinder, more tolerant person. But all of that seems to have been forgotten. We are all in a bad situation. It makes me think of this moment in Fences.
It's not easy for me to admit that I've been standing in the same place for 18 years.
Well, I've been standing with you. I've been right here with you, Troy. I got a life too. I gave 18 years of my life to stand in the same spot as you.
You don't know what it's like to be stuck in place? Mate, we're all there together, all of us. But we're still actually more stuck in the mud and stuck in a worse place. Capitalism was given its name. I can't take credit for it. Brandon came up with it. Because it just sells crap back to you. Both literally by selling us plastic, which is polluting the planet in the name of constant growth, and crap in terms of the idea of meritocracy. And I know that the masculinity crisis dudes actually hate meritocracy because DEI genuinely enforces meritocracy. As I've been illustrating throughout this video, fascism thrives off othering, off promoting nationalism and restoring the patriarchy by pushing others down. But mate, giving people rights is not like serving up a pie, which means, oh man, I'm not going to get most of the pie anymore. That's not how it works. The reason that we're getting less is because of corruption in politics, because of sleazy lobbyists. And politicians catering to the rich because that's where the money comes from. This is a class issue. It's a haves and have-nots issue. Them saying that other people getting rights, which by the way aren't even close to the rights and privileges that white men get, as the real reason that you're suffering and not succeeding in the world is more crap that you're just being fed. The version of masculinity that fascism loves is this brutish, uncaring kind, which makes you desensitized and also dehumanize others, which ultimately is only gonna make you better soldiers for them. I also want people to take note of how they're making it harder for people to be able to travel now, for people who have changed their names. Guess who typically changes their names the most? Women who get married. This is another video I want to dive into actually. So whilst folks like Trump keep on saying that these more stringent rules are to control the bad people, It's genuinely about suppressing everybody but white men who fall into line with what Trump wants. For a closing quote, I'm just going to refer back to Bell Hooks. Again, one of my favorite books. If patriarchy were truly rewarding to men, the violence and addiction and family life that is so pervasive would not exist. This violence was not created by feminism. If patriarchy were rewarding the overwhelming dissatisfaction most men feel in their work lives, a dissatisfaction extensively documented in the works of Studs Terkel and Susan Faludi would not exist. Whew. And yes, I have been reading an awful lot for these videos, so I think if you made it all the way to the end of this video, let's leave the books emoji. And I want to say an extra special thank you to all of my patrons, especially to my top tier Trash Panda enablers. Alyssa Pisani, Birgit, Carrie Quake, Danielle, Jam, Jem, Laura Bell, Megan Connolly, Michaela Garfinkel, Mila Gautier, Stella Sapiente, Tammy Poitras, Tim Long, Tonya Banier, Cat Mama. Actually, I think that we should end this video on one of the most iconic clips from a musical ever, because this is the exact attitude that we should be having towards the stuff that is happening right now. And I'm just going to encourage people to get to know your neighbors more. Get involved in your local community. And oh, there's a video which I'm going to be making about that soon, actually. For real, I am convinced that the red cap has become the symbol for American fascism. Every time I see a red cap that anybody is wearing, if it's in a photo, even if it's orange, I'm like, ah! I get a scare. I'm like, what happened to you? Like, that's how much of a visceral reaction this has created in me. So I can't even imagine what that's like for people living in the US. All right, have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.
Ah!